We human beings like to think that we're rational creatures, carefully looking at an array of objective factors before we make a decision. In a professional setting like a content strategy or design practice, we may feel like we're at the pinnacle of this rationality. In fact, we're operating on autopilot about 95% of the time, making decisions based on biases that are hardwired into our thinking. Dave Thomas can help you understand and tame these cognitive biases and make better design and business decisions.
Welcome to the Content Strategy Insights podcast, where accomplished content strategy experts share their wisdom with our friends in the content community. We talk with professionals who work across the span of content strategy, from small businesses to big enterprises, from content design to content marketing, from solo consultancies to huge agencies. Our mission is to democratize content strategy, to make its principles and practices accessible to everyone. And now, here's your host, Larry Swanson.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode number 80 of the Content Strategy Insights podcast. I'm really happy today to have with us Dave Thomas. David Dillon Thomas was with us 2 years ago, shortly after the Confab 2018, where he and I talked. So welcome back, Dave. I'm excited to see your new book. It's called Design for Cognitive Bias. So tell us a little bit about the book and what folks can expect from it.
Sure. Well, first off, really happy to be back. I can't believe it's been 2 years. Wow. So I wrote a book called Design for Cognitive Bias, actually building on some of the ideas I think we chatted about way back when. And the basic idea is understanding that as designers or content strategists, basically people who make things, part of our job is helping people make decisions. And in order to do our jobs well, we really need to understand how people make decisions. And for the past few years, I've been studying bias and how it informs how we make decisions. So I've tried to take what I've understood about bias and combined it with what I understand about content strategy and user experience to try to give us tools to be more responsible in the way that we use design and the way that we use content strategy.
Right. And I love that responsibility and ethics really underlie a huge amount of your work. There's a lot of like conventional economics and a lot of the social sciences are based on this idea that human beings are these rational critters and we're just going to, we've got these big brains that we use all the time. And so we're good to go. We're set, right? So we're pretty rational creatures and these biases are just minor inconveniences. Is that the case?
Yeah, so I have a section in the book called The Myth of the Rational User. And the thing we have to understand is that something like 95% of human cognition goes on underneath the hood, like below the level of conscious thought. So most of the decisions you're making, even right now, are not conscious. They're on autopilot. So just now you took a sip of your, tea, like you could have thought very carefully about, well, how exactly do I want to hold that tea and how long do I want to sip for? And exactly where do I want to put the tea down when I put it down? If you thought carefully about every single one of those decisions, we wouldn't get through this podcast, right? You'd barely get through the day. So a lot of these things are just on autopilot and that's usually a good thing. But every now and then those shortcuts we're taking lead to errors and we call those cognitive biases.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that's how I first discovered you. I loved the Cognitive Bias podcast, and I'd urge anybody who's listening to go back and listen to it. It was great, very short overviews of all these cognitive biases. But you've now taken all those and kind of rounded them up and thought about their implications for design practice and what to do with it. Can you talk just a little bit more about kind of the scope of those biases and maybe a little bit about that? This fundamental irrationality that I think some people have need a little work to get their heads around.
Sure. Well, it's funny. I mean, thanks for your kind words about the podcast. I'd been doing that for a little while when I was asked by the city of Philadelphia to come and speak about accessibility for a internal panel they were doing, and they wanted to include cognitive bias in that realm of accessibility. So it forced me to start to think about the intersection between UX and bias. And one of the first places I saw this was anonymized resumes, right? So unfortunately, in experiment after experiment, if you take two identical resumes and the only difference is the name at the top of the resume, if it's a male-dominated field, the male name resume will keep going and then the female resume will just stay on the pile. And that's a bias. It's a shortcut where the person looking at that resume has some pattern built up in their head that, if it's a web designer job, web designer equals male. And even though if you asked them, like in their conscious thought, hey, do you think men are better designers than women? They'd say, no, of course, that's ridiculous. But the pattern that's been built up, like that shortcut, when they're looking at that resume, just at a glance, they start to give it the side eye. And so the design approach for that might be to say, well, hey, from a content strategy perspective, that's not actually useful information in the first place. Like the name isn't helping you decide who you should hire. So why don't we just take that out? Why don't we just remove that design element and any other design elements that might be biasing you in a way that's not useful, and just leave the important information and redesign the resume to be less biased or to not trigger your biases so easily. So that's really like the prime example when I think of that intersection between, we understand that there's this bias that people are going to default to without even realizing it. What can we as content strategists and designers do to create the rethink the tool, in this case, the resume, to better serve a less biased outcome?
Right, and you talk, I mean, so much of design talk is often about making frictionless, easy experiences, but a lot of this is about like kind of slowing people down a little bit and getting them to think about, like, does it really matter if their name is, how their name is relevant to this job, filling this job position. So is that one of the main principles, is just figuring out ways to derail or sidetrack these biases a little bit?
It's really undermining two notions we have about design. So one is, as you said, about frictionless design, where we think, oh, you want the most frictionless experience possible. But the fact of the matter is, bias comes directly from thinking too fast. So one of the foundational works on bias is called Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. And the whole upshot is that when you're thinking very quickly, that's when you're most likely to run into these errors. When you really process and slow down your thinking is when you're less likely to fall for some of this stuff. So part of it is understanding where you should be putting in speed bumps to improve the quality of your users' decisions. And then the other piece is, we think as designers, we're supposed to be artfully revealing information. But what's most useful for the user sometimes is to conceal information. So that's where like the anonymized resume comes in. It kind of challenges that notion of, oh, you have to give the user all of the information and do it in this really progressive disclosure, cool way. And like, when in fact, one of the decisions you have to make as a designer and as a content strategist is, what shouldn't I show? What's actually going to make this worse if I show it, right? So I think those are the two, like from a design perspective, the things we kind of have to rethink when we're designing for cognitive bias.
That's really interesting, because I've studied design for years, and I'm thinking back to my early days, and I don't recall that ever being revealed as like a concern, that like being thoughtful and to what you said earlier about being ethical about like what you choose. Like that example you used of the Philadelphia hiring process, one of the follow-ons to that was like, okay, we're going to black out the name so that you don't see that. But the first thing people do is go look at their GitHub repo, and then they immediately review that. So they had a technical fix for that. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Oh, sure. So actually following on that, when the city of Philadelphia asked me to speak about bias, I ended up talking to a guy who at the time was their chief data officer. And he said, oh, it's funny you brought that up, because we tried a round of blind hiring for our web developer position. And we realized that first we'd have to have someone like physically print out the resume and black it out with a marker, like someone who had no stake in the hiring process, like an intern. And then you would have the hiring manager look at that blacked out resume and pick some resumes that they liked. But what you do if you're hiring a web developer typically is you want to look at their GitHub profile. GitHub is a code repository, and you can kind of see a developer's portfolio, so to speak, by going there. And so they would go there, look it up, and immediately, right, if you go to their GitHub profile, well, there's their name and all the other personal information that you were trying to conceal before. So very cleverly, they created a Chrome plugin that would actually redact all of that information as it loaded, so you wouldn't see it. And then they took that code and put it back on GitHub. It's actually there now if you want to use it for your own anonymized hiring.
Nice. Well, I'm trying to think of other examples like that. There's so many examples in the book that for like for every cognitive bias you talked about, you had a good example of that. I'm trying to think of other things like that are more, because the putting the guardrails and speed bumps in, that's one thing. Are there more proactive practices that arise from your insights around cognitive biases?
Sure. I mean, a lot of the proactive things you need to do really come to process, right? Like, how are you actually designing the things you're doing? So, there's things I talk about like red team, blue team, where we have our typical processes around, oh, we're going to do some research and then we're going to, create some wireframes and then we're going to, put it into design and then we're going to develop it and test it. And there are opportunities there to avoid decisions that lean into confirmation bias, or thinking you've hit on the solution when actually there's a much better solution you haven't explored yet, or thinking you've hit on the solution but you've not thought about the potential harm. So red team, blue team is a practice that's been around for a while. It's used by the military, it's used by journalists, and the basic idea is you do that first round of review where it's like, okay, I'm going to do the research. I'm going to come up with maybe some wireframes, get the idea into a place where it can be expressed. But then before I go any further, like a red team is going to come in and really take apart the work I've done. And not design critique in the sense of, oh, I'm going to look at the aesthetics or the flow. I'm going to look at more like, hey, is there better design you've left on the table because you're so in love with the original idea? Or is there harm that you haven't even, hasn't occurred to you might be caused by this thing? Because again, you've been so narrowly focused on making this one solution work. And there are any number of procedures like that. Speculative design is another good one, where if you build that in, it's a good way to proactively say, rather than put it out in the world and wait for all the bad emails to come in saying, why did you do this, right? I'm going to proactively try to anticipate, okay, what could go wrong, right? What's the unhappy path? I think it's kind of ironic. We spend so much time as designers thinking about the happy path and like, okay, how are we going to delight our users with this? When in fact, it should be patently obvious that there are far more things that can go wrong than can go right. So we should actually be spending way more time thinking about what could go wrong and designing for that, and then less time, not no time, but less time on having things go right, because that's actually going to be not the majority of cases necessarily.
Well, that's right. The rose-colored glasses tinting so many of our decisions. I was just reading last night, I was reminded of Barbara Ehrenreich's book about the negative impacts of the positive culture, positivity culture in America, a book that came out about 10 years ago. But there's some analogy there. It seems like that we always start with the best of intention and the best hope, but keeping kind of consciously adopting not a negative, but a critical mindset as you go through. Is that a good way to think about that?
Yeah, I mean, the bias that comes to mind is called survivorship bias. And there's a great little story where there's a guy, Abraham Wald, who was a genius mathematician in Europe during World War II. And he fled because he was Jewish and the Nazis were moving in. I believe he was in Austria, and he fled to the States. And while he was there, he was asked by the military to help them with a bunch of other scientists figure out like where to best put armament on planes to keep them from getting shot down so much. And so they had a bunch of planes there. And the planes, had bullet holes in all these different places. And the other scientists in the room were basically saying, hey, obviously you've got all these bullet holes. You should just be putting more armament there. And Abraham Wald said, wait, that's exactly where you shouldn't put more armament. And what he realized was they were looking at the planes that made it back. What they needed to be looking at were the planes that got shot so bad that they couldn't make it back. Those were the ones that were critically injured. And those pretty obviously were hit everywhere else, right? So if you look at and picture the plane and all the places that didn't have bullet holes, those are the most essential places. You need to put more armament there. And the team in that room was looking at the survivors. They were looking at the best case scenario, when what they really need to be thinking about was the worst case scenario. And as designers, we're very good at thinking about and selling, frankly, the best case scenario, but we need to devote as much time, if not more, to thinking about those bad cases if we really want resilient, useful design.
I love that. And are there analogies, like if you were evaluating a portfolio of products that some company had, how would you do that, like as a digital designer, to go in and look at like a product history and go like, well, this worked, this didn't. How do you infer those bullet holes and where the armor should be in your digital design?
I mean, I think that there are exercises and ways to think about that. Again, proactively as you're doing the work. I had a client once where we were trying to. It's interesting. This was specifically not around functionality, but really around voice and tone, to come up with the different voice and tone characteristics of error messaging. And so we went through the product flow And we spent like 2-3 hours specifically just going point by point. Okay, what could go wrong here? Okay, what could go wrong here? All right, what is the user feeling at this point, and how are they going to feel if this goes wrong versus if that goes wrong? And just to basically come up with a library of potential emotions on which we could then build like a voice and tone guide. But the way to get there was to literally think about every single thing that could go wrong and document that. And to me, that's kind of what I'm thinking of when you talk about that portfolio examples. It's sort of like, hey, this is great to show me all the designs you have around the good use cases. I also want to see your designs around the bad use cases. And what choices did you make to account for those?
Right. Okay. I get that. I love that. Hey, and one of the things, so much of what we're talking about is like the end product design, but all of this happens in the context of internal relationships, the various stakeholders, both the clients that you're working with, but also your internal team and all that. And one of the things I love about the book is the way you organize it so that that gets equal weight to the designs. That's equally as important to talk about like how you do it as to what you're doing. Can you talk a little bit? And I was trying to infer as I went, I couldn't really put it together. Are there certain families of biases that apply more at the customer facing level, at the internal level, or
I think that it's funny you put it that way, because I think that just to clarify, the book is structured first to just ground the reader in, okay, what is bias? What am I talking about? And then we move really into just user biases and how to mitigate those. Then we move into sort of your coworkers, your stakeholders biases as a designer, as a strategist. And then at the end, we talk about your biases personally. And I think you're right. As you move through the book, I hadn't noticed this before, but I think like user biases, there's like hundreds of them. The stakeholder biases tend to fall into like 3 or 4 main buckets. And then finally, when we're talking about your biases, there's basically 3 biases that are really, really dangerous that I end up talking about. But for the stakeholder bias, it's interesting. I think that a lot of what I'm talking about there is understanding that just as your users are making decisions 95% of the time without thinking, the same is true of your stakeholders. And you have to understand that if you're having trouble like convincing your boss of something or convincing your client of something, they're not just being obstinate for the sake of being obstinate. There's probably something underneath the hood. And a lot of times it comes down to things like incentivization, right? So if they're not going to get their bonus unless they ship, 15 products this quarter, maybe that's why they're averse to research, because it's going to take up time and take time away from that, right? And if you don't understand that as a designer and as a collaborator, you're going to have a difficult time like talking to them and convincing them of the value of research, for example. Or if you're trying to make an argument about something, it's good to understand that I talk a lot in that section about loss aversion and this idea that it hurts more to lose something than it feels good to gain something. So it hurts twice as much to lose $5 as it feels good to find $5. And so oftentimes when we're approaching our bosses, our clients, people we answer to, and we want them to take a risky choice, they're coming at that from a fear of losing more than they are from feeling it's good to win something. And that manifests itself as when you're trying to get a client to make a risky decision, it's better to point out the downside of not making that decision than it is to point out the upside of it. So for example, if I had to convince you to abandon this legacy CMS that nobody likes, but you keep using because of sunk cost fallacy and status quo bias, it's like it's the devil and it feels risky to try something new. I could say, oh, well, this is how much money you're going to make if you switch CMSs and there's going to be unicorns tap dancing down the hallway. It's going to be wonderful. That won't be as effective as saying, oh, if you keep with this bad CMS, here's how much money you're going to lose. Here's how many people are going to quit and that you're going to have to retrain and rehire people on this terrible CMS, right? That's going to be a more convincing argument for people who are feeling risk averse. And again, it just goes back to this phenomenon called loss aversion. So there's a handful of biases you can kind of rely on that it's very likely the organization you're dealing with is going to succumb to. And if you understand them, it's kind of easier to navigate and figure out how to frame your argument in a way that's more helpful.
Got it. Hey, and another kind of framing, you just reminded me that I think it's the very end of that section on stakeholder and team stuff that you talk about physical design of meeting spaces and workshop spaces. Can you talk a little bit about that and how that fits into these?
Yeah, so one of the core things I've been talking about for a while now, and I credit a guy named Derek Płazik about this. He literally wrote the book on design for community back in the day. It's called Design for Community, like in early 2000. And one of the concepts he introduced me to is this notion that, we like to think that like online conflict is happening because people show up and they're just angry and they want to fight. And then that's why Twitter is terrible and Facebook is terrible. And that's part of it, obviously. But one of the things he points out is the design, the actual design of those online spaces and the design of physical spaces can actually influence the kind of conversation people are willing to have. And it's really fascinating to see the science on this. So for example, if I'm in a room, if I'm having a meeting, and there is a suitcase in that room that everyone can see, people are going to act more competitively than if instead of a briefcase, it's a backpack, right? And it's just, we're primed to sort of think of business and competition and cutthroat if we see a briefcase, and we embody that. And it's just interesting to see that play out. Another thing is money. The second you bring up money, people act less pro-socially and more, competitively. And so there's a section of the book where I do a case study around an organization that had to figure out how to divvy up federal funding for an at-risk population in a major metropolitan city. And they had lots of stakeholders who had to make this decision from lots of different walks of life. And they would always just make the same decision every time. Like whatever the budget was last year, they'd be like, okay, let's spend it the same way again, because it was the safe choice. They weren't really collaborating. They weren't really engaging with the material. So they redesigned the physical space that this group was meeting in to allow for more green space, to make it more movable, because if we feel confined, we tend to make safer decisions. We don't tend to be as creative. My favorite move was that they took a coat rack that was in the back of the room and nobody used to the front of the room. And then to get people to actually use the coat rack, they would use their own like work sweaters and kind of seat it with that. So when people walked in, there was always already a couple of things on the coat rack, and that would sort of free them up to actually use it. And it seemed like a small thing, but the reason they did that was when you first walked in, it looked like that space was a space that was used by human beings, right? You've been in these like meeting rooms where it's like, this room was designed for computer sav meetings. Like this wasn't designed for human beings to use. Yep. So all of those things led to a more warm environment. And from an agenda standpoint, they didn't bring up money until the very, very end. Like they changed the agenda too, to make it more pro-social. But all of that cumulative effect was, it was the same people, it was the same topic, but these framing choices, these design choices got those people to a point where they could look at those needs, right, without the context of the previous budget, but just look at what was needed and say, oh, this thing used to be needed. We've actually taken care of that now. Here's this new emerging need. Let's shift the budgeting over to this new emerging need, which was kind of the problem to begin with, right? And
that only happened because of the work with the physical space that you're in. I love that. That sounds like a whole other book.
Oh, I'm sure you could. You totally could. Yeah. And in fact, to be fair, there's a book by Ingrid Patel Lee called Joyful that was part of the inspiration for them changing the design of that space. So credit where credit is due. That was actually part of what inspired them. So there is literally a whole other book to be written about the design of spaces.
Yeah. Hey, I want to make sure we get also to the last part of the book where you talk about accounting for your own biases in your professional conduct and practice. Tell me a little bit about that. Like, and again, you said there's just about like three predictable biases that come up in.
Yeah, the ones I really focus on are notational bias, which is really just how your own prejudices can find their way into how you structure content. Like the most obvious example is if I'm creating a form that's supposed to gather personal information, and when it comes to gender, in my head, I only think there are two genders, male and female. If I create the form that way, I'm going to erase all these identities without even like really thinking about it. So that's notational bias. So there has to be a way to kind of check your own prejudices there. There's confirmation bias, which is really just this, we talked a little about before, is like, oh, I found the perfect answer. I found the perfect design. So I'm just going to go down that path. And true, like, scientific method, for example, doesn't just say, I'm going to test something, and if I'm right, great, let's move on. True scientific method says, okay, I'm going to test something, and if I'm right, I'm going to now do everything I can to prove myself wrong. I'm going to say, if I'm wrong, what else might be true? Let me test that. And that's a really more rigorous way to find the better solution. And there are examples in the book I give of how easy it is to simply think you've got the perfect solution and miss a completely obvious better solution. And really the solution there to avoiding that outcome is just to have other people, other perspectives in the room, preferably perspectives of people less powerful than you, people who are going to be impacted by that design, who don't have as much power as you. In fact, if you can kind of give them power by not only like using them as research subjects, but actually make them stakeholders where the design doesn't ship unless they're happy, like that's where inevitably the end of the book really becomes about design ethics and design justice. Like you can't talk about this and have that not be the inevitable outcome. So really it's almost like at the end of the book, I'm like, gotcha, this is actually about design ethics. Like, you know, but that I think is where you sort of need to get to. Is the book tries to give you sort of useful, constructive ways to invite other perspectives and give power and honor to other perspectives that are not your own in order to create this more ethical, helpful, less harmful design.
You just reminded me of an old cartoon, a guy at a vending machine that says ethics, and he's like trying to reach up and steal something out of it. That's sort of your approach to this book. That's great. Yeah, well, hey, Dave, we're coming up close. Well, actually, one thing I wanted to ask about that, one of the things you use in there because like if you're in that facing like confirmation bias, I can't remember if this is exactly how you used it, but if you're facing that in like a design process, you'd go to like blue team, red team or something like that. But in your own, you closed near the end, you talked about Black Mirror. Like whenever you have a good idea and are getting like confirmed in your own head about this is a great idea, we're going to do this, pause, write a Black Mirror episode about it. And then revisit. Is that talk a little bit about
so I
that.
mentioned speculative design earlier, and that's really what like the formal name for what a show like Black Mirror is. Black Mirror, if you haven't seen it, is sort of like Twilight Zone for tech. It takes some near future tech and then tell a story about how an actual human being would use it, and the outcome is usually terrible. And I argue that anyone working on a new technology by law should have to write a Black Mirror episode about it. But it really is this, actual job where you can sort of take a design and put it through its paces or take a course of action and really think through the outcome. Superflex did a thing with the United Arab Emirates back in the day where the UAE was trying to figure out, are we going to continue down the path of fossil fuels or should we invest in renewables? And Superflex came in and said, okay, let's think about what your air quality is going to be like 5 years out, 10 years out, 15 years out. And they didn't just figure out what it would be like, they bottled it. Right. And then they made them breathe it. And then by 10 years out, it's unbreathable. Right. And so by the end of that engagement, they were like, yeah, we're going to invest. I think they said like $150 billion in renewables. So like it's a really, honestly, it's kind of a fun way to create the unhappy path is to just tell a story about it. The same way that you tell user stories about, oh, this is what it looks like when the feature goes well, right? We do user stories for that. We should also do user stories for, oh, this is what happens when the user does something terrible,
Oh, and there's nothing more vivid, that example of like, and here's how your world will smell if you pursue this path. That's super powerful. Yeah. Well, hey, Dave, I'm close. Oh, sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
No, I just want to say the other thing, as I said, there were 3 biases that the one that is really important that I close with is called déformation professionnelle. And it's this idea of seeing the world through the lens of your job. And so where I kind of build to at the end, spoiler alert, I guess, is that we as designers need to define our jobs beyond just make cool stuff. We really need to say, okay, how can we design things in a way that lets us be more human to each other? And again, I give some examples of how that can go very, very wrong and why we need to be very concerned about that. But that's the other key bias I think we can fall into as designers and content strategists is, oh, I've done my job if I create a really cool sounding strategy that's going to get, all this engagement, right? Like I've done my job. And it's like, if you define your job that narrowly, you are at risk for introducing something harmful without even realizing it.
Right. No, that seems super powerful and potentially really dangerous. That it's like that's the Nuremberg thing. I'm just doing my job.
Oh yeah.
So yeah. Well, hey Dave, we're coming up close to time. I always like to give my guests a chance. Is there anything that hasn't come up or that's just on your mind about design and cognitive biases or content strategy or
Sure. So I would say in general, like if you want to keep up with all things Dave, daviddylan-thomas.com has links to my book. It has links to hire me to be a speaker and to just get in touch. But it also has a link to an event I have coming up. If this launches on the launch date for the book, which is August 25th, on August 28th, which is going to be the Friday after, at the end of that week, I am doing a launch party, a digital launch party where you can come. The price of the ticket actually includes a digital copy of the book. It's only $10. And you can come, and I'm going to do a book reading. I'm going to do an interview with a guy named Alex Hillman, who just created his own book called Tiny MBA. We're going to do Q&A. We're going to do this fun thing called an idea exchange. It's going to be a lot of fun. So if you are free on Friday, August 28th, come to the launch party.
Great. And I'm looking forward to it. And I do, assuming I can stay on schedule with production, I plan to drop this on the book launch date on the 25th. So folks should have,
awesome.
And I'll announce that ahead of time too. And also one last thing, if people just want to follow you in general, what's the best way? Twitter, LinkedIn? Do you have a preferred medium?
Yeah, I'm on Twitter at movie_pundit. And my Twitter and my LinkedIn are also on daviddylan-thomas.com. If you go there, it's probably the one-stop shopping for all things Dave. So I would just go there.
Great. I'll put those in the show notes as well. Well, thanks so much, Dave. It was fun. I feel like I've made a big loop here coming back around. So thanks so much for coming back.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
Thank you for listening. If you can think of a friend who might enjoy this episode, please share it with them. And please join us again for our next content strategy interview.